chapter 10 records a list of the 12 apostles, remember, as they were being commissioned by the Lord. Matthew chapter 10, go ahead and turn there. I want you to look at this with me as we start our time this morning. Look at the first verse. Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. Now, the names of the 12 apostles are these. The first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James, the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out. Judas Iscariot was apparently from the Judean village of Kerioth. Look at that word Iscariot, that word that is presented there as a part of his identification. That's a word which is taken from Ish, which is the word there for man, and Kerioth, which is the village, and so it means a man of Kerioth. Whatever it's worth, that would make Judas the only one of the 12 who was actually from Judea. The others, remember, were Galileans. We don't know a lot more about Judas. We just don't. Apart from his being listed among the 12, the Gospels, in fact, say very little about him until the week preceding his desperately wicked act of betraying Jesus. But that's where I want to take you now. So in Matthew, go to chapter 26. Mark your place there. We're going to read some verses, and then we're going to go somewhere else, and we're going to come back. Look at verse 14. Then one of the 12, named Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me to betray him to you?" And they weighed out 30 pieces of silver to him. And from then on, Judas began looking for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. I want you to turn to Luke chapter 22. Mark your place there in 26 of Matthew. Luke 22, I want to take you here because Luke includes an important detail that Matthew omits. That's why it's such a blessing to have all four of the Gospels. Luke 22, we'll read 6 verses here. Now the feast of unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was approaching. The chief priests and the scribes were seeking how they might put Jesus to death. They were afraid of the people, and so they were doing it secretly, as the intention of the text there. Verse 3, and Satan entered into Judas, who was called Iscariot. That's what Matthew omits. Satan entered into Judas, belonged to the number of the 12. Judas went away and discussed with the chief priests and the officers how he might betray Jesus to them. They were glad, agreed to give him money. So Judas consented and began seeking a good opportunity to betray Jesus to them apart from the crowd. And now go back to Matthew 26. Let's look at the matter of the betrayal here. You remember the scene. Jesus is in the garden praying. Judas obviously, conspicuously absent. Verse 46, it's the appointed time. Jesus was fully aware. And in 46, he says to the men, he says, "Get up, let us be going." Not to run from the reality that was coming, but to go and to meet it. "Get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand." While Jesus was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, came up, accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs. Who came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign, saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him. Immediately Judas went to Jesus and said, Hail, Rabbi, and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, Friend, do what you have come for. Then they seized him. They laid hands on him, it says. And from that particular point in time, we know what's going to happen. Scripture is an amazing gift to us, isn't it? So every word presents us with the opportunity to learn, doesn't it? That's what we have it for, so that we can learn from it. And I think that one of the great and simple ways that we can learn from Scripture is through the study of its characters. Simply through the character studies that Scripture contains. The Bible is, of course, quite literally filled with stories of godly and faithful men and women. Men and women who serve as examples for us as how we should live out our faith. One of the texts that I really love is Hebrews chapter 11. That's a great summary text, isn't it? It's a great summary text there because it reminds you of many of our Old Testament heroes of the faith. You just go there and there's that list, just one after the other, godly people who served and left behind this great example. Of course, the New Testament also contains many other examples as well. Certainly, you think of Peter, you think of Paul. Really, you can think of all of the apostles, save for Judas, Priscilla, Aquila. I mean, it just goes on and on. We have all of these great character studies, all of these people who we can learn from in a great way. But I want to remind you this morning that sometimes we learn through the study of the godless people who you find in Scripture. Sometimes we learn from their testimonies. Sometimes we learn from the lives that were lived out by the faithless. This is certainly the case when we study Judas Iscariot. As we step back and look at the tragic downward spiral of his life's end, we can learn some really needful lessons. That's what we want to do today with our time. I want to focus this morning on 4. I'll give you 4 lessons from the life of Judas Iscariot. We'll get right after these. Let me give you the first. Hopefully this one is obvious to you. Here's the first lesson we learn as students of the life of Judas. You ready? Lesson number 1. Not all who profess to know and love Christ really do. Not all who profess to know Him and who profess to love Him and serve Him do it all. It's true, we've seen this Scripture doesn't give us a lot of detail on the life of Judas, but what we do know about him is worth our consideration. Just think along these lines. For starters, Judas was one, remember, of the hand-picked 12. Right? He's one of 12. That's a pretty amazing thing, isn't it? That's a small and select group, and it is especially impressive when you think about the fact that the Gospels tell us that throughout his career, multitudes of people often followed Jesus. Not dozens, not hundreds, but at times, remember, even thousands of people listened to him. But remember, for his part, this is important, Jesus deliberately and specifically invested himself intimately, most closely, remember this, into just 12 men, and Judas was one of those 12. That should cause you to realize that Judas really had an amazing front row seat, didn't it? He had a front row seat to the ministry of Jesus for some 3 years. Now, think about that. For 3 years, Judas walked with Jesus. He didn't occasionally meet Jesus in the synagogue. He walked with him for 3 years. Remember, he shared meals with him every day. He prayed with Jesus. He was taught how to pray by Jesus. No doubt during all of those 3 years, Judas also observed Jesus in a very careful way. Certainly heard him teach, didn't he? That's what Jesus did. Jesus taught. He proclaimed the gospel of the kingdom. He did that continually all the time. Judas heard Jesus teach. He heard him preach almost continually. Judas saw Jesus heal the sick, the desperately sick. He saw Jesus cause the lame to walk. He saw Jesus give sight to the blind. Judas listened to Jesus, now listen to this, as he forgave sins. Judas was with Jesus when he rebuked the prideful Jewish religious authorities. Judas watched, probably even assisted, as Jesus fed thousands of people with 5 loaves of bread and just a couple of fish. Remember, he was there probably passing baskets. Apparently, Judas was even present. Remember when Jesus, in John chapter 11, verse 43, cried out, "Lazarus, come forth," and a man long dead walked forward from the grave. Don't ever lose that perspective on Judas. Don't ever lose sight of the perspective that he should have had, the privilege that he did have. Beyond all of those things, we know that Judas was the treasurer for the band. As Jesus went from place to place with the band of disciples and his followers, Judas was the treasurer. We know that because John chapter 12, verse 6 tells us that he carried the money box. It's an important detail in the text there because it's an indication that Judas was probably of really excellent reputation, right? Who do you give the money box to? Well, you probably give it to somebody who can count, but you certainly are going to go out of your way to give it to somebody who has a sterling reputation. Give it to a guy who you can trust, right? That was Judas. Judas was the man who carried the money box. It's also significant, I think, when you think about the reputation of Judas, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke make no special reference to Judas Iscariot prior to the triumphal entry. They don't talk about him, and that's important because that's almost certainly an indication that he had not yet distinguished himself as the traitor that he was.